some modern poetry as best we can. For the most part, I'm going to be approaching it just kind of by the author. So we may be covering a couple different poems in a single kind of pass through. And by no means are we doing just justice within a week. So we'll just do what we can. Well, let's start just kind of getting some background on modern poetry. Now, there's definitely some stuff to talk about, but there's a little bit of overlap with modern short stories. So you'll get that a little bit. So let's talk about this. So after the deaths of Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, American poetry went into something of a decline from 1890 to 1910. A lot of industrialization and so on going on there, just not a lot of poetry going on just yet. When American poetry resurfaced, it was strong enough to wash away the last traces of British influence. So we finally start seeing a much more authentic American tone and language. Now, a couple of things about Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, kind of back up a little bit. Walt Whitman, we talked about, was a guy who really was a bridge of transcendentalism. And he was a guy who really focused on the big picture. All the universe really was up for grabs. And he gave universal value to everything. In kind of the opposite end of that spectrum, you had Emily Dickinson, who took the everyday and the mundane and the very simple, domestic stuff and gave it value. So in a way, they're kind of bookends, if you will, of these ideals that modernism holds and harbors. So again, they're kind of precursors in a sense, transitional folks, but they, through their styles and their subject matter, lead the way into what becomes the modernist movement, shall we say, in poetry. So modern American poetry was dazzling. It was varied and experimental. It was just a lot of variety. It was always something new. They began to explore artistic life in Europe, particularly Paris. So there were a lot of expats that ended up there, just like with the novels and the short story authors and those guys. They absorbed the lessons of the modernist painters like Matisse and Picasso, and who were exploring new ways to see and represent reality. So those artists, and again, all of the movements we've really dealt with, most of them anyways, have had an actual artistic an artistic movement with it, not just a literary one, but there was obviously the cultural, artistic, even political, for that matter, in some capacity. So I'm gonna spare you guys. I encourage you guys to look at 738, 739. There's not a lot of reading to do there, but I'm gonna kind of talk about these things just real quick. So the styles of modern poetry. First off, it was definitely experimental. Ezra Pound, I believe, was the one who said, make it new. So it was all about new subject matter, new forms. You had the rise of the symbolists and the imagists, those folks who just had poems that were painting a picture, that was just an image of something. So kind of getting that mind's eye thing, if you will. So they were experimental in their language and their styles, their structures, a whole bunch of stuff there. Those who reworked traditional forms, specifically the text reference is Edna St. Vincent Millay and Robert Frost. Robert Frost worked with blank verse. We're going to see that today. You guys are going to be looking at some of that stuff. Experiments a lot with blank verse. And the truth is, a lot of poets do that, but he doesn't keep necessarily, stanzas and forms quite the same way, like if we read Birches and things like that. And it's much more casual and conversational in such a fashion that you almost wouldn't even know that there is form to it. It's only when you look at the structure and you go, oh, these lines are kind of about the same length, you realize maybe something's going on here, which is always a cue when you're looking at poetry. Millay, though, works heavily with sonnets, and again, she's kind of modernizing the structure of those and the rhymes and so on, but still 14-line poems and still some structure there. So the themes that are explored in modern poetry, and there's a whole lot of them, but disillusionment, just like the modern short story authors, the disillusionment, anxiety. It's called The Age of Anxiety by A.W.H. Auden. Um, so they do explore the new perceptions of human nature in the universe, especially after the dissolution of the First World War. But this um, the possibilities of human relationships, the structures and complexities of human relationships, the emotional and psychological elements that bear on them as well. So all sorts of things. But when you look through that uh, second to last paragraph, there's a whole bunch of stuff. The greed um, that is running rampant right now in modern society. The fact that as modern as we've gotten, there seems to be an increase of violence and poverty and corruption, and so they're looking at a lot of those different things. Um, but also this opportunity to reorder and renew human values. So the likes of Robert Lowell, uh, uh, um, or sorry, William Carlos Williams attempts to do that, where um, Robert Frost and the like kind of again are exploring the nature of human relationships and even humanity's relationship to nature itself. So a lot of stuff going on there. So let's get into symbolism. In a similar way, poets sought to create poems that invited new ways of seeing and thinking. So symbolism was this form of expression in which the world of appearances is violently rearranged by artists who seek a different and more truthful version of reality. So it's really trying to understand things on a different level. They did not merely describe objects; they tried to portray the emotional effect the objects can suggest. The symbolists believe that imagination is more reliable than reason and just as precise. Now, that should sound familiar because if we go back yonder into the Romantics, they had a very similar ideal. And the Romantics, as we know, used a lot of symbolism, especially from nature, death, and things like that. So the symbolists are doing the same thing, except they're doing it on a little bit more of a pedestrian level, a more mundane level. But again, they're emphasizing imagination just the same. Uh, they also emphasize mysterious and the intuitive. So again, there's a little bit of element of romanticism there, and we saw that also with the likes of Edgar Allan Poe and the dark poets and the kind of oh, what was it, the Gothics, right, and even the likes of Hawthorne and Scarlet Letter kind of focus a little bit on that. So symbolists hope to bring revelation, self-discovery to the readers through poems that lead the imagination to discover truths. And so there should be some reflection and self-insight that comes with those kinds of that kind of poetry, and also an outward thing where as you look out beyond your own perception, you're able to gain insight and see greater depths to the things around you in the world. So again, a new manifestation of the Romantics, as I mentioned already. The Romantics had stressed the importance of feeling and the independence of the individual. They had made a great stand against the mechanization of human life. The symbolists are doing the same thing here. In the natural world, the Romantics found messages that spoke to the soul and gave it strength. So it's all there. So again, a visual here, Night Fires. Again, this is 1919 by Joseph Stella. It doesn't seem like much of a picture, and granted, it's a little bit grainy on my screen here, but it is capturing again, as a symbol, it is capturing the inherent risk. You have kind of an industrial um, uh, setting that you're looking at, and the fire, and so it's there's symbolism in this in terms of the inherent risk and danger that comes with modernist living. Yes, it's in the form of a fire here, and obviously when you're dealing with machinery and so on, this type of stuff happens, and it's on a great scale when such a fire occurs, and so there's great tragedy and great terror that goes along with that, and that is encapsulated in an image such as this, and we can go into greater depth, but that's the gist of it, right? So the symbolist found neither solace nor spiritual renewal in nature. Nature had been subjected to so much scientific classification and interpretation that it had been stripped of much of its mystery. Okay, so that's where they separate from the Romantics in a sense. They're not necessarily looking for any sort of solace or renewal in nature. Artists faced the onslaught of the modern world, which, in spite of advances in science and technology, suffered increased poverty, violence, and conflict. There you go. The symbolists saw that this new world spiritually debased, and they faced it with distaste and outrage. So there's, I won't say necessarily a tone of disgust, but it's that is definitely a fuel of the symbolists in their poetry there. So they tried to refine what is meant to be human in times when individualism was succumbing to the power of mass culture. So we see all this stuff through the 20th century, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But let's get into the imagism real quick. So the two Americans who first came into close contact with symbolism and introduced the techniques of the movement of the United States were Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. With the help of several British poets, a group of Americans led by Pound founded a school perhaps better known and understood in the U.S. Than symbolism itself. This was called Imagism, which flourished in the years 1912 and 1917. So we're talking pretty much around that World War I time. So like the symbolists, imagists believe that poetry can be made pure by concentration on the precise, clear, and unqualified image. Now, imagery alone, the imagists believe, could carry a poem's emotion and message, so just what you see in your mind's eye. It could do this almost instantly without all the elaborate metrics and stanza patterns that were part of poetry's traditional mode. So when the imagist, a lot of the times, it was a couple of lines of poetry. It may not have even been rhyming. It was just poetic imagery through words. So the imagist, Pound, H.D. Lowell, took on the role of reformers. They would rid poetry of its prettiness, sentimentality, and artificiality, all of these things which they thought were ultimately unnecessary and did injustice to the truth, shall we say, concentrating instead on the raw power of the image to communicate feeling and thought. Again, so Pound, as kind of one of the leaders here, defined it as that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. So his very famous poem here is In a Station of the Metro, right? So he's sitting there and he's watching people getting on a train. And the poem is literally 2 words, 2 lines long. Just the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. So the image that he is presenting here, right, are petals that are on a tree limb, right, on a wet black bough. And he's relating that, so he's juxtaposing that with the faces in a crowd in a metro station. And petals being a beautiful thing, and so there's a positivity that goes with that juxtaposition that he's making. So he remembers again his inspiration. He says, 3 years ago in Paris, I got out of a metro train at Le Concorde and saw suddenly a beautiful face, and then another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful woman, and I tried all that day to find words for what that had meant to me, and I could not find any words that seemed to me worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. And so the petals on a wet black bough were the way that he communicated that emotion and that beauty and his feeling of that crowd and all the beautiful faces that he saw. And again, he's doing it through an image, and the image itself stands alone. He doesn't go into greater explanation than he lets it do what it needs to do in our minds. It says this poem took a long time to write. His first attempt contained 30 lines, his second 15. He did not produce the final 2-line poem until a year had passed. So to put that in perspective, I mean, that's how much they're boiling down and how precise the verbiage is, the imagery is, the descriptions, the adjectives, all parts of speech in this thing are very, very well refined. And this is what makes this poetry complex and begs an analysis of that complexity. And the implications of every particular word, petals, wet, a black bough. What is all that saying? Why is all that important? How does that imagery all come to our mind? So again, this is a new way of seeing and experiencing the world. Today, poems with imagistic technique are very commonplace for us. We do see it all the time now. At the time, though, their theory created a greater stir. They insisted that the range of poetic subject matter might include the kitchen sink, as well as the rising of the moon, the trash can, as well as the Chinese porcelain vase. All of these things held value as images in our minds and emotions that they could evoke. So, the strongest opposition was caused by their proposal to create new rhymes as the expression of new moods. We do believe that the individuality of a poet may often be better expressed in free verse than in conventional forms. So that's what we again start to see with modernist poetry. There's far less adherence to traditional forms, and we've seen again that already with romantics. So this is just compounding that. To traditional poets, this was deplorable and meant a loosening of poetic standards and an assault on the very craft of poetry. So some of these guys were dismissed, quite frankly, as being, just, petty poets that didn't know any better and had no true craft. So when you think of modernist art, right, versus the classical art, we've talked about this already when we got to romantics. The classical art had much more precise texturing and shadowing, and it was true to life with maybe vibrant colors and that kind of thing. But then you have modernist stuff, which is much more like the Impressionists were kind of a transitional piece for that. And so the modernist art is much more, again, your emotional impression and the coloring and everything's kind of a little bit fuzzier and shapes and structure, but not necessarily real. And so that was, again, part of the argument that traditional folks made. This is not really, my 4-year-old could draw a picture like that, that kind of thing, or write this poem. So they didn't yet realize that successful free verse was at least as difficult to create as traditionally written verse, and that these guys were very deliberate in what they did. I don't know, you read Walt Whitman stuff, it's pretty obvious to me. But to kind of finalize this stuff, this is our last slide here. When we look at the modernist poetry, the last thing I want to say is what we see today, to kind of see how this transition happened. I mean, the modernists, they were disillusioned and they were writing stuff to try and make things new and evolve the forms. Today, our poetry has much more of a social justice element to it, and it's a lot more deliberate. Or it's a form of distraction, and that's what we see a lot of times with music, which is the primary form of poetry most of us consume these days. It is meant to evoke emotion and to distract us, and it is a cathartic process, perhaps, but it doesn't necessarily push us into a new realm of understanding or insight to the world. It can. There's definitely stuff out there, but again, we're in a consumer society, so it's a little different now. So anyways, as we move into the poetry, there's definitely a whole lot of stuff, and we're going to be approaching a little bit differently. I think I'm going to be doing a little bit more guiding on this. So our final week should be wrapping up pretty quick and pretty, hopefully, easy for you guys. And more information to come. So there's our poetry intro, and we'll end it there. Thanks, guys.